So yesterday morning, I rambled about what's kept us busy over the past year and especially over the past few months and about what we're planning for next year. Today, I'm going to talk about what keeps us up at night thinking. It's pretty straightforward to assemble groups of our members and listen to them and understand the opportunities to facilitate collaboration and sharing. It's not so simple to address long-term systemic practices built into our industry as a microcosm of society as a whole. Social injustice is everywhere, including its prevalence within our industry. I've been in this industry, if you define it as home entertainment, for 35 years, actually opening my first video rental store 35 years ago this week. And when I look back at the executives that I've known in this industry, they've been predominantly a parade of white men like me. Yes, there's been a growing share of female execs going back to the 90s, but does that share even now represent anywhere near a share of population? And to say that I can call out the names of the handful of studio executives that I've known of color in the home entertainment industry, I can call them out by name, is pretty horrific. I'm not pointing out anything unusual or anything that should be surprising, just something that is obviously and clearly wrong. It's not unique to our industry, but that doesn't make it any more right or anything that we need to accept. As a trade association supporting our industry, we have both an opportunity and an obligation to address social injustices and to impact change. At the very least, because we consider ourselves to be thought leaders and because we have a bully pulpit, even though it's just the small part of society that we call our community. But what can we do and what should we do? We don't want to be giving lip service to the issues. We don't want to be heralding a cause of the day to feel good. Look, on Juneteenth, my wife and I watched one of the pandemic online live streams. It was of a play called Polar Bears, Black Boys, and Prairie Fringed Orchids. It was a play written by a friend and former employee, Vince Durham. It centered on a cocktail party hosted by a liberal white couple in Manhattan with guests at their cocktail party, including a Black Lives Matter activist and a mother of a slain 12-year-old black son. Core to the story was that the liberal host looked at supporting the war against social injustice much the same way as she looked at, hence the title, saving the polar bear and saving the prairie orchids. She collected causes without a view of what social justice actually looks like. Yeah, it made me think a lot, really made me think a lot about how I or we should be approaching this. Many of you know that this is an issue that strikes close to home for me. I never faced prejudice myself growing up, and I grew up with a mother who also collected causes, although I certainly knew that her heart was in the right place. Many of my friends growing up were orphans and were underprivileged, and I was taught what I thought was something to be proud of, to wear as a badge. I was taught to be colorblind. For example, I'm sure that the only blacks that ever entered my Orthodox synagogue in Troy, New York, were my friends who attended my bar mitzvah. In my family, to my parents, it was a badge of honor to be a privileged white family who treated the neighbor's black housekeeper and her family as friends, not help. As I entered my professional career, I spent many of my early years not working alongside a single person of color. I felt proud that I was finally in a position to hire people that I hired with color blindness and promoted the same way. When I ran my first chain of video stores in New England, a number of my store managers were black, and one of my 5 district managers was as well. Although thinking back, my entire office was pure lily white. And when I moved to Pennsylvania to run store ops for a public chain, West Coast Video, for my short stint there, I don't recall having a single store manager of color out of our 400 plus stores. But I didn't stay there long enough to take this on. I moved to Los Angeles 20 years ago to take a job at what was then VSDA, now our OTT.X. A decade later, after being single all my life, I met the love of my life, my current wife, Julie. I was still colorblind. Julie's black. I didn't see color. I just saw the person that I fell in love with. But then it started. I didn't expect what Julie had lived with all her life. The looks when we'd walk down the street or into a restaurant together, hand in hand. The reactions of some of our friends when I introduced Julie, friends who I knew well enough to be able to read their faces. The whispering would overhear in public places. The service or lack of would get in some stores. And all of this was even more visible when we travel, especially into the South. And I never knew what it felt like to be in a minority until I attended family get-togethers with Julie's side of the family. A great family, and I love them all. And no one's ever done anything other than embrace me. But just the same, I felt different. Nobody looked like me. Wow, this is what Julie has spent all of her life with in white society. For years, I'd insensitively and naively accused my wife of being too thin-skinned or sensitive or imagining the way she's being treated. Just like I thought being colorblind was a badge of honor to wear, I thought that good people could never express prejudice. After all these years, it's taken the dialogues encouraged after the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor murders for me to think hard about how society has embraced prejudice, whether or not intentional, and how racism has been systemic. And eventually to think about why we have, why we have a conference auditorium at one of our conferences, or a Zoom call full of mostly white men, and a podium near always completely white men. The day after George Floyd was murdered, my wife came into my office and lamented that she'd been getting calls and emails all morning from her white business colleagues asking whether she was okay. She felt like she was the polar bear they wanted to protect as their cause of the day. In some cases, or maybe even in all cases, the concerns were sincere, but no one offered anything more than, "How are you doing?" So when Eric, Steve, and I met later that same day for our weekly staff meeting, the topic came up. What should we be doing as a trade association? And we all felt the same. Whatever we do, as small as it might be, needs to be meaningful and shouldn't just be participating in the cause of the day. Our commitments were short-term and long-term. In the short term, we immediately pulled together a list of resources that our members could avail themselves of to better understand the issues, and not only to be an advocate, but to also be an ally. And that resource currently resides on our OTT.X website. We also committed to provide platforms for discussion and long term, a series of fireside chats delivering information about inspiration to and tools for taking positive action toward eliminating racism, prejudice, hatred, and exclusion in our industry. The first of these chats, A Path Toward Inclusion in the Workplace, was held with Portia Green, Global Head of Learning and Organizational Development at Fandango, and it's available now on the homepage of our website. But this isn't enough. As a trade association, we need to be example setters. We need to fill visible speaker slots at our events with more people of color. And I don't just mean a representation, I mean a noticeable percentage, if not a majority, Some might say, isn't that reverse discrimination? After all these years of not being represented, I don't think it's a valid concern. Others might say, won't prioritizing color over qualifications bring down the value of presentations at our events? And I'll argue that having much more diversity is going to do nothing other than enrich the value of our presentations. And who's to say that we haven't been depriving ourselves of quality over the past years by having everybody in the podium that looks like me? And as a trade association, we need to help pave a solution. We can't just dump the problem solving on those being oppressed. These dialogues toward a solution can't only be among those being injusticed. We, the privileged whites, need to take an active and often uncomfortable role in change. Talking about it's a start. That's why I'm addressing it today. When Cameron Douglas and I discussed how we'd be addressing the situation, he suggested to me, he asked me to make it personal. And I have. But look, we have to rely on the support of our members to help make a difference, whether setting an example with more speakers of color or facilitating meaningful dialogues that may help address some of the injustices faced in our ecosystem. Over the next few weeks, I'll be soliciting members for a task force to figure out how our little corner of society, our OTT ecosystem, can take steps toward equality and toward allyship. For now, I just want to leave with a reminder that, look, well, we're all the same, we're all different. Treating everybody the same is like being colorblind. We need to embrace our differences, but recognize that despite differences, we're all equals. And opportunities need to be made equally. We can and we need to find ways to affect systemic racism and civil injustice in our little corner of society, in our OTT ecosystem. Fair and equal isn't enough anymore. For those of you beginning celebration tonight, I wish you a happy Hanukkah. I wish everybody a happy holiday season. Please stay safe, stay healthy, on to a much better 2021. And back to Eric to get today's agenda started.